You're going to have to build new factories. That takes years to accomplish. And then you have to find workers who are willing to work in a textile factory and train them and pay American wages for them.
Before we get started with the show, here's a quick word from our sponsor, Global Training Center. As trade compliance professionals, you want to make sure that your procedures and documentation are completed as correctly as possible to avoid any delays and possible fines. We provide a range of trade compliance courses that will fit your needs. From in-person or web training to recorded on-demand courses, we can train one or even thousands on your team through your learning platform or on our portal. We can even customize a private session for your team. Go to globaltrainingcenter.com to find out more.
Hey, folks, we're back for another episode of Trade podcast. And with that, we are going to have a good discussion today. But with that, I will also say good morning to you, Lila, and I hope that things are going well. It looks like, as at the time we're recording this, it appears that doggone groundhog in Pennsylvania was actually pretty accurate, because spring is coming on pretty quick. We had 75-degree weather yesterday, and it's going to be about 65, 68 degrees here in Memphis again today. So how about y'all down there in El Paso?
Yeah, same here. It's just in the 80s, and so it's been really nice. So by the time people hear this, it'll hopefully everybody's already warmed up. But we're talking about mid-February here, and so that's it's still a lot of places that are pretty darn chilly. But here in West Texas anyway, it's in the low 80s. So yeah,
Winter's all done in Texas.
Oh, there you go. Folks, we have a special guest that's coming on. She's been on before. And with that is Lila Landis. She's very well respected in the industry. And you've earned your stripes, my dear. It's like, my goodness, it's you're very smart, but you've got some good credentials and have worked with some good companies and whatnot. And I'm looking forward to today's discussion. We're going to talk a little bit about what's going on as far as the import-export community, and talk about some of the top priorities with that. But Lila, before we bring her on, is there any last little things you want to talk about, Lila, for us?
Recently, she became Chief Compliance Officer at Seco Logistics. So I'm assuming that means she's now a C-suite person. And then last time she was on our show, she talked about talking to the C-suite. So take her advice, because she actually she's been there, she's now there, and she has really good information about that. She's also recently signed up to do courses with a course with Global Training Center. So we'll talk a little bit about that at the end. But more than anything, we're very happy to have her back on, because she has a very busy schedule, and we're happy to have her on. Our topic today is going to be really cool. I really think it's in tune with what's going on this year with the new elections coming up, and how trade might evolve. So.
Yeah, well, there's so much going on. I'm really excited to talk about it today.
With that, let's get started, and we'll jump right on in. What do you see as some of the top trends, I guess, in the compliance arena, especially with this election year and all the things, trying to project out, well, if this person's elected, what do you think is going to happen to some of our trade deals or whatever else? So what do you think is some of the top trending items there, Lila?
Well, I think we're seeing a lot of enforcement, both import and export. And so, now more than ever, I think importer exporters really need to be managing their risks and paying attention to what's going on in terms of regulatory updates and enforcement actions on the import and export side. On the import, we're seeing a lot of forced labor detentions. In the first year of UFLPA, the detentions were over $1 billion in value for shipments that they detained, and that's really not slowing down. It's something where, they're paying very close attention to changes in country of origin, right? It's not something where, importers can try to just route through a third party country like Malaysia or Vietnam or Indonesia and think that you're going to be able to avoid forced labor scrutiny. This is something where, CBP has access to this massive amount of data from ACE, and they are using that data, that metadata, to really identify when there are changes to commodities in terms of country of origin, changes to HS codes, and they're catching that the same way that we saw with Section 301. So a lot of enforcement going on there.
Well, and with that, you can imagine with such, a massive amounts of data, they're going to also be comparing of that entry data to, other data files, if you will, of things and trends and items going on in different industries. So, to compare even prices, valuation kind of thing of what people are selling, retail, wholesale, all that. Don't think that customs doesn't have a good idea and that you can pull one over them, especially in today's world where we're so information heavy. So, if this is your entry, well, let's see how it matches up to other data elements that they have access to. And as they compare that, they'll be, even with artificial intelligence to, people doing an actual analysis and red flags going up to see what's happening with that. I think that's a big deal. But the enforcement side is also a scenario there where I've heard that, and Lila and I both have heard that from many different sides of the government. FMC is one, the Federal Maritime Commission. We've had discussion on that when they are talking about some enforcement activities from that realm. And I'm like, man, I'm shocked. I hadn't thought about it.
Well, FMC really got a shot in the arm, right, with the Ocean Shipping Reform Act, with OSRA, when that got passed. And that was it was very reactionary to what a lot of people felt like was ocean carriers kind of taking advantage of shippers during the pandemic, when we had, really low capacity for freight and a huge increase in demand with e-com, that they felt like a lot of ocean carriers were abusing that new, balance of power in terms of supply and demand, and going overboard on detention and demurrage and kind of like cherry picking which customers would get equipment and things like that. And that's how OSRA came about. And we're starting to see enforcement actions from that. So that just fully took effect, I believe, June of 2022. And we've seen investigations and enforcement actions coming out of that, not just for ocean carriers, but actually for freight forwarders who are in VOCCs as well. And so definitely something that, the service providers need to be taking stock of, making sure that their FMC compliance is up to date, and that shippers should be aware of that there are new tools available to them if they think that they are not being treated fairly by their service provider.
To that point, what would be, a couple of key actions that somebody that should take if they're an exporter or an importer company using obviously freight forwarders or ocean carriers? What would be the action you would recommend that they should take to either become proficient or check things out for them?
I think definitely making sure that they have read some of what's going on with the Ocean Shipping Reform Act to understand what it is that FMC is looking for as violations. If they're not already very well versed in kind of how ocean shipping works and the differences between carriers and then VOCCs, that's kind of a good place to start. If you have a service provider that you trust, or a couple of service providers, you could also just ask them to do a little bit of training with you on kind of Ocean Freight 101, FMC 101, that sort of thing. A lot of the FMC training that you'll find out there is designed for the service providers themselves. And so it's much more detailed than an importer exporter would really want to know or want to spend that much time on. But understanding the basics is really important. The other thing that I'd recommend is that if they're not already doing some kind of auditing of their service providers' invoices, they really should. And so you want to make sure that you have, you understand what are your contracted rates as far as, what have you agreed to, and that you're doing some kind of invoice auditing. may not need to be 100% invoice auditing, but you should be sampling different invoices and just making sure, does this match the rates that we agreed to? Does this match what was quoted to me? Do these charges make sense?
The rates themselves may be fine, but where a lot of times service providers, what they'll do is start adding a lot of ancillary fees. Some of them are legitimate that due to what they're handling, but some of them could be overinflated ancillary fees or whatever. And so they'll nickel and dime you to death kind of thing. Would that be valid?
Yeah, absolutely. That is, it's of course, it's an unethical practice, but it certainly happens. And so then that is part of what you would want to look at when you are doing an invoice audit is not just the rate itself, but certainly any fees that have been charged, with a particular eye on detention and demurrage on that, because that is the one that FMC particularly is, looking at as far as, sometimes being abused.
So the next thing is as far as some of the other things that are going on, what seems to be another top issue that you see that, we should be looking at? Should we consider, if somebody gets in office or not, or stays in office or not, or whatever the case is, what do you think is going to happen?
So I think we're looking at, from a trade compliance perspective, two very, very different environments depending on the outcome of the election, right? And I'm not endorsing either candidate or saying who's going to be better or anything like that. I'm just saying we are looking at very different environments. So a second Biden administration, from a trade perspective, I think they're going to continue to focus on, pressuring CBP, who's in turn pressuring logistics providers to do more to stop the flow of fentanyl and, fentanyl precursors and other, drug making materials into the U.S. That's a really hot topic right now. It's one where they're looking at, e-commerce and the small packages coming in as being a source of that. I can tell you, I've looked at the numbers myself, and actually the majority of contraband is coming in through U.S. mail. It's not coming in through, the e-commerce packages that are processed by your traditional logistics providers. But that's where the political pressure is. It's on CBP to do more in terms of seizures and in terms of, pressuring logistics providers to do a lot of due diligence and stop the flow of drugs into the country. So certainly there's pressure on that. Continue to see, some action in terms of trying to reduce, illegal immigration, because we have seen a surge in that, border crossings over the past couple of years. So looking at that. And then I think on the export side, continued enforcement of sanctions on Russia. So the day today that we're filming this, by the Biden administration just announced 500 new sanctions targets for Russia in response to the death of Navalny, the opposition leader in Russia, and then continued war in Ukraine. So I think we'll see enforcement on that. And the other high priority thing I think is just going to be really with semiconductors, supercomputers, AI, high tech, in terms of keeping that out of the hands of the Chinese military industrial complex. And so continuing to see a focus from BIS on, advancing those rules, rewriting them, trying to keep up with the pace of technology, and trying to keep China's industry from advancing further in terms of semiconductors and those kind of high tech priorities for the U.S. So that's what I think that we would see in a second Biden administration, is a continuation of a lot of the things that we're seeing right now. I don't really foresee any major trade changes under a second Biden administration. If we have a Trump administration, if we have Trump coming back into the office, it's really hard to predict, right? Because campaign promises don't always mean a whole lot, right? People aren't able or necessarily willing to fulfill all the campaign promises that they make. But what we're hearing from Trump is a desire to be even tougher on China in a second term. So he has proposed that he would raise tariffs on China to 60% or perhaps more. Currently, with Section 301, for the products that are targeted by Section 301 and don't have exclusions, the maximum tariff, additional tariff, is 25%. It ranges from 15 to 25%, depending on which list you're looking at. So 60% or more tariffs on China, that would be a huge change from what we're seeing right now. when we had Section 301 tariffs start there in 2018, I think at the time, a lot of us in the trade community and a lot of economists all felt like that companies were not going to absorb this. It was going to be directly passed on to consumers, and that consumers were really going to feel this hit in their wallet. That's really not quite what happened. So one of the things that we saw is companies change their sourcing to try to, avoid being hit with the Section 301 duties. Some of that through third-party countries where they weren't really changing the sourcing, and some of that legitimate changes in sourcing if they were able to pivot to a different manufacturing location. But we also saw where we did see some absorption of those tariffs without having it directly passed on to consumers through the price. And so it didn't have as much of an effect as we expected.
Right. Well, but one of the things that it was looked at is apparently the China manufacturers discounted their price to offset the 301 tariffs. So in that, then what happened is then the Chinese government was subsidizing that at the manufacturer level.
But I think that the ability to do that when you look at 60% tariffs or 80% tariffs or 100% tariffs, right? That's a whole different ballgame than looking at a 25% tariff. And what Trump is suggesting right now is that those tariffs would be applied to all products coming from China. It would not be the targeted list that we've seen in Section 301. That would certainly be very, very different. I think a lot of consumers would feel the pinch from that, right? Where you would suddenly have much, much higher prices for a lot of goods that we buy every day. Certainly in particular, I'm thinking about textiles, right? Because, of the millions and millions of e-commerce packages that come into the U.S. every day, about 30% of those are from two popular e-commerce companies that sell, various goods, but a lot of fast fashion, a lot of clothing that comes in under that. And so those are all Chinese origin. I think that if they were not able to avoid, Section 301 or tariffs under, a different regime for that, it's certainly something that would hurt their business, and it would hurt consumers because they wouldn't be able to buy, a $10 shirt anymore. Those prices would go up significantly. But I think the goal there, with what the Trump team is thinking is that they're going to spur the return of manufacturing those goods in the U.S. But that really, to me, kind of ignores the reality of what it would take to start manufacturing something that we don't already make here, right? There's very, very little textile manufacturing that goes on in the U.S. anymore. And with good reason, because textile manufacturing is actually very dangerous, right? It's a dangerous business where people get injured, and it's something where, it's much cheaper in terms of labor to do that in other countries where you have a lower labor cost. That's why it moved overseas in the first place. So to bring that back to the U.S., you're talking about greenfielding those factories. You're going to have to build new factories. That takes years to accomplish. And then you have to find workers who are willing to work in a textile factory and train them and pay American wages for them. And that's just one of those industries. So I think that there's a lot there where suddenly implementing a 60% tariff or more is not going to result in immediate, American manufacturing rebirth. And my opinion is just that we're focusing on the wrong types of things anyway to be trying to build. We need to be looking at more of the high-tech products and manufacturing that here. I think the CHIPS Act is doing some of that. But I think that there needs to be more of a push to move faster. I don't think that there's been enough of the investments actually realized from the CHIPS Act fast enough to really make as much of a difference as we need. But that's the type of thing that I think would be more beneficial for American manufacturing. I don't think we really want to try to bring textile jobs back. So I think that it'll be really interesting to see how a second Trump administration approaches Russia and Ukraine, right? So we've seen a continued enforcement of the Russia sanctions. We've seen really strong support for Ukraine and the Ukrainian military, with a lot of U.S. companies directly supporting the Ukrainian military, sending, bulletproof vests and all sorts of military goods there. And so I think there's not a whole lot for us to go on as far as how the Trump administration would approach that. But we do see that the Republican Party, of which Trump is a member, has been reticent to continue sending aid to Ukraine. So we may see then a drop off in aid to Ukraine with a second Trump administration. We may see, either the Trump administration not wanting to put any new sanctions on Russia, or even possibly a relaxation of the sanctions on Russia, because they don't necessarily have the same view on Russia that the Biden administration has. And so, which I think would be kind of really difficult for the trade community to handle, because right now, if you're in the U.S. and you're dealing with Russia sanctions, it's just been a continued ramp up to being almost completely comprehensively sanctioned, right? And so then to have that pulled back, it would be trying to understand, okay, where are we at with Russia now? What are we doing? What can we do? What can we not do? Again, that just makes it all the more important to have really good export compliance folks in your organization who can help guide you. But I think that there's certainly a lot of uncertainty there. I do think that we would see a Trump administration continue to focus on the semiconductor, advanced computing, and AI technology controls to try to keep those out of the hands of China. I think that's something where both administrations would agree on the necessity of that.
Things that I'm seeing that would expect as far as the Trump administration regarding Russia is probably a focus on those countries that seem to be allowing a circumvention of the sanctions. In particular, Switzerland has, I just came across this where they're, 2 years into some of these heavy sanctions, and Switzerland, claiming to be a neutral country, has allowed for the facilitation of trade, if you will, of the buying, selling, and financial transactions. That Switzerland, they froze, as it said, $7.7 billion of Swiss francs, but there's $150 billion in Swiss francs in Russian accounts. So, with that right there, everybody can do what they can, but they're still allowed to go through this, this neutral country, quote unquote. The other scenario there is with China and Iran that are basically propping up Russia's economy, using other currencies. And then the other thing that a current situation that is troubling is so far with the BRICS initiative trying to replace the U.S. dollar as the reserve currency on the international market, with Brazil, Russia, India, China, now Saudi Arabia, and some other countries that are trying to use other currencies other than the U.S. dollar. Well, with that, and that's all came about in less than a year's time frame, a year and a half ago. And it'll be interesting. I would say that under a Trump administration, I think that he would be focused on trying to basically stop that initiative. But it'll be interesting because that's going to hurt the U.S. economy.
The Biden administration did just sanction a Swiss energies trader who has been facilitating Russian oil trade from Switzerland. So they are definitely looking at that. And both the U.S., UK, EU are all looking at some of the third-party countries that are being used as major diversion points for getting goods into and out of Russia as well. So Turkey, Turkmenistan, other former USSR countries who are known to be diversion points. It's something where, we at SECO have seen this where, we've had a couple of inquiries come through that were red flagged and reviewed by me, and they were, asking to ship some military goods, and they were asking for, prices to 2 different countries that both bordered Russia. And so that's a pretty good clue that you're not actually intending to have it stay in that country, and it's probably going to Russia, right? So this is definitely something where, a lot of companies, unethical companies out there are trying to do this. They are still successfully getting goods into and out of Russia. And so, the U.S. government and our allies just need to keep going after those and keep looking for examples of that to do. I think that's one of the areas where, we're going to see a lot more use of data and AI to process data in the future. So there was an article that came out maybe, I want to say a couple months ago, where it was a nonprofit group that analyzed satellite data to be able to show that there were a whole lot of ocean vessels that were not showing up as officially registered.
Oh yeah, the black, what do they call the black ships, whether they turn off their transponders?
Yeah. So you have, they estimated that it's somewhere around 60% of ocean shipping activities actually not being officially registered because of the number of ships that are either older and they don't have that equipment installed, or the ability to just turn it off, right? Which, if you're doing sanctions evasion, that's what you're going to do, right? You're going to turn off your responder so that it doesn't show that, hey, I'm actually taking stuff between China and North Korea.
Hang on just a second. So for our audience, what we are talking about is that there would be a ship loaded with, let's say, goods coming, directly out of Russia or out of, as you just mentioned, North Korea or some of these nefarious countries, and their transponders are turned off, so it's not showing up on, if you will, the international radar, if you want to call it that. Anyway, so you'd be able to track it, and a lot of times these ships will meet another ship out on the ocean, transload their goods, and then that second ship will then at some point, which is registered, is fine, and they'll turn on their transponder, turn it back on when they're coming into port or whatever, and it'll make it look like they had some technical difficulties, whatever, but that their goods came from a legitimate source and that they're coming into port, when in fact, it's happened with a lot of petroleum. It's happened with other goods, but all said and done, that's what we're talking about when we're talking about a black ship or something like that.
Weapons smuggling as well. This is something that goes on a lot with weapons smuggling. So we had the recent Navy SEAL boarding a vessel suspected of weapons smuggling, and they did make arrests coming out of that. And so then this is something that the U.S. and other governments go after. But I think that that's a great example of really what we're going to be able to do with access to more data and using AI tools that can process, terabytes worth of data in, less time than we've ever seen before.
Lila, with all of this, there's, the different things. Then we have the Red Sea situation that's going on and things going in and out of Yemen, which is now becoming suspect. You've got, again, the Russian-Ukraine war. You've got the sanctions going on, the China situation, and geopolitical situations all over. Then you also have which is at risk, and that's the China-Taiwan situation and the implications there, where China is adamant that they claim that they're going to be trying to take Taiwan back within probably the next 6 to 8 months, according to the last time frame. Whether or not that's true or not, I don't know. The point being is that within a year, they are wanting to take Taiwan back. And so that said, that would be a major hit to other supplies, especially the chips, as you were talking about, and the need to accelerate. But all these different things that are going on in the geopolitical realm and regions and all that, if you're in a compliance role, how in the world can you keep up with all of this? You may be limited in your staff or whatever. Do you have any suggestions regarding that situation?
Yeah, absolutely. I think, there's a lot of great training resources out there that highlight just the biggest news so that you are not trying to filter through everything yourself. There's trade nerds like me who do filter through everything, right? And pick out what's interesting. But even I love, looking at different trade news sources. So, there's a lot of great ways to do that. Certainly, SimplyTrade podcast, right? We highlight a lot of stuff here. So ICPA is another great organization that you can pay attention to for updated training. Global Training Center is another great option for training. There's a lot of really good global trade newsletters out there, and certainly your service providers, right? If you hopefully you have a strong relationship with either a customs broker, a freight forwarder, or a couple of them, really turn to them. If you should be doing regular quarterly business reviews with them anyway, where they are, talking to you about your shipping activity, showing you KPIs and things like that. Ask them to have their compliance participate in your QBRs and to give you a regulatory update, right? Ask them to just highlight for you some of the major things that are going on. Lean on them to help you with those types of things. I would also say, one of the best things is to try to just filter through the noise by thinking about what's truly a risk for your organization. Right. So I mentioned e-commerce and fentanyl and CBP's enforcement on that. If you're not doing any importing of de minimis shipments, then it could affect you as a consumer, but it doesn't affect your organization. And so that might be one where, I'm really not going to read a whole lot into that. But maybe, you are in a company that is a high tech company. You should be paying attention to what's going on with, semiconductors and advanced computing and AI and the enforcement actions with a BIS on what they've been doing, rewriting those rules, the notice of proposed rulemaking that just came out for infrastructure as a service providers, things like that. So really focusing on what's relevant for your organization. If you've already done a risk assessment before for your organization, now's a good time to go back and update it. So go back and update that risk assessment to look at what are your highest level risks, compare that to kind of what is going on in the regulatory environment in terms of risk for your organization, and then that will give you priorities to focus on.
So let's stop for right there. It's like when you're talking about doing a risk assessment, when you say whether the high, what could be a high risk area or whatever, what are you talking about there? Are you talking about as far as transportation lanes? Are you talking about classification or valuation? Or are you talking about, or what? I mean, when we're saying risk, what are you going to be looking for?
Yeah, so I would say, to me, I look at it from a compliance perspective, and so then, risk areas that I would look at classification. Is this something, a high risk area for you? If classification would be a high risk area for you, if it's one where you don't have documented procedures on how you classify maybe you do have documented procedures, but you have millions of different products across many different chapters where there's a higher risk of getting something wrong, right? Because of the extreme volume that you have. Maybe you have something that's highly technical where you have to involve, engineering or research and development in order to get your classifications right. Those would be, examples of where I would say that that's maybe a higher risk area for you. Also, if you're using a lot of duty programs like free trade agreements, or, you have Section 301 and you're using exclusions for that, you do a lot of U.S. goods returned and things like that. Those are higher risk activities to be involved in. Another example, if you're looking at from a shipping perspective of just your shipping lanes, you would want to consider how much cross-border trade do you do on the southern border. Right? If you do a lot between U.S. and Mexico, certainly that's a high risk area because we've seen different border crossings shut down due to issues there where CBP has just totally closed them down for periods of time while they're dealing with the volume of crossings there. So that would be an example. If you are doing a lot of shipments from Asia and you've been affected by the rerouting of ocean vessels away from the Red Sea due to the Houthi attacks, that would be something where you would classify as high risk. So those are some of the areas that I would look at when I'm doing a risk assessment.
All right. Hey, excuse me, Lila, you were talking about some of the new developments within the Global Training Center and whatnot. Did you want to bring up a couple of topics there for what you've got planned?
So what we're doing is we partnered with Lila here, and we created a really neat course. It's a little different from what everybody else is doing in the sense that it's not a necessarily a e-learning course, not necessarily a live course. It's more of a combination of both. It's a hybrid course, and you're not taking that over a 1-day period. For example, this is more of a 4-week course, kind of like a mini semester at a college or university, where you're consuming content online and you're consuming lessons and doing a little bit of homework, maybe, and discussions online. So it's what we call community-based training. And we didn't invent that term. It's actually a term out there in the industry. So with a community-based training, it's really neat in that everybody gets to collaborate and talk to each other and pretty much learn from each other with the guidance of Global Training Center, and in this case, our instructor, Lila. But she created a really neat course that we're building a compliance program within your company. So that compliance program can include things like your trade compliance manual, for example. And it kind of lines up with a lot of what we're talking today in the sense that, Lila will probably be able to say better about that, but, more like,
yeah, we'll talk about the risk assessment. So, week one, actually, we're going to be focused on just assessing your organization, really trying to determine, what are your major risks and gap areas so that you know what to focus on with your compliance program. So that's part of what we'll address. And we are definitely going to talk about how to write your compliance manual, what needs to be in it from both an import and export perspective. And so we'll go through that in weeks 2 and 3. And then week 4, we wrap it up by talking about additional topics like training and auditing that should be in anyone's compliance manual, and how to level up your compliance program. What do you do once you've got the basics in place to really take it to the next level?
Folks, this is one of those things that I would tell you that if you are in charge of your compliance area and you yourself are busy running that area and that department, you need to pick somebody like your second in command or whatever, at least to look into getting, if you're not going to do it yourself, to take some kind of training like what we just mentioned with Lila and in this program. I mean, it's not going to be a case where you're 4 weeks steady. It's a case where I'm sure that there's, you do some of your training and then you have a whole lot of homework where you're going in and assessing and doing some of your own look into your own company. But if you are new to the industry and you're working your way up and you want to have aspirations of becoming a director of compliance or a manager of compliance in your area, or you're at the C level, whatever, at some point, this is one of those areas that will give you that knowledge of what to manage, how to do it. Is it going to be a hands-on, or are you going to be an advisor type group? But you got to have the knowledge in that. And if you're going to be hands-on, then you're running a compliance operation that's hands-on, looks at that. If you're going to be an advisor, you have people in your company that are doing the work and you're advising them, kind of like a consultant type scenario, internal, but to keep them on track. So whether either way you go, this is a course that would be ideal to help you create a vision for your compliance area, and from that, where your weak points are in your company and what you need to focus on conversely, where your strong points are and where you don't need to, waste a whole lot of time. You've already got good things in there, and you're focusing on where you need to shore up some issues.
And I think one of the great things about the way that we've structured this course is to have the ability to ask questions, where, Professor Lila is going to have office hours available to you each of the 4 weeks during the course to be able to answer your specific questions. And so you can ask about, well, how would this apply to my organization, or what might I be missing? Things like that.
Outstanding. Well, I will say, Lila, due to time, we're going to need to wrap this up, but I will say also that you are, just as always, I always love the discussion and perspective that you bring. Some good discussion on just the trends and the compliance. And it's almost overwhelming when you stop and think and trying to handle what's going on a global basis and how it affects your company. But on the same token, you're breaking it down into bite-sized pieces that we can swallow it and either become proficient or know what action we need to take. I appreciate that with you.
Thank you. Well, it's been my pleasure. I'm always happy to talk trade, and thank you so much for having me back on again.
Definitely. Lalo, any last comments before we sign off?
No, just thankful that Lila was able to come on. Again, I know you're very busy, Lila, and especially having 3 little ones running around the house as well. So balancing work-life balance and everything. So, but thank you so much. And we look forward to, at least virtually, seeing you at ICPA. I know you're going to attend virtually. So
I'll be running some virtual networking sessions. So
yeah, exactly. Yeah. That's what I saw. So that's what I mean. Look out for that if you're attending virtually, and also anything that Andy and I may be pushing out also from the conference. We're going to be trying to push out some content from there as well, and as usual, do our man on the streets type stuff. But that's it. I guess that's all we have for today. Thank you all for joining us.
Folks, have a great day. And again, thank you for liking our show, share it, give us some comments and whatnot. But we appreciate your listenership. And with that, have a great day.
Thank you very much for joining us. SimplyTrade is brought to you by the generous contributions of Global Training Center. You can follow the show and GTC on LinkedIn or Twitter and other social networks. Make sure you check out the show notes in the description for a full rundown of today's show with all the important links. Also, make sure that you share this with a friend and subscribe on your favorite streaming platform. We really like hearing from you. If you enjoyed the show, make sure to rate and review wherever you listen to this podcast. If you or someone you know would like to be a guest on the show or would like to sponsor SimplyTrade or suggest any topic you would like for us to discuss, please contact us via email at simplytrade@globaltrainingcenter.com, or you can DM us on Twitter at SimplyTradePod. Thank you again for the privilege of your time. Happy trading. SimplyTrade is not a law firm or an advisor. The topics and discussions conducted by SimplyTrade hosts and guests should not be considered and is not intended to substitute legal advice. You should seek appropriate counsel for your own situations. These conversations and information are directed towards listeners in the United States for informational, educational, and entertainment purposes only and should not be substituted for legal advice. No listener or viewer of this podcast should act or refrain from acting on the basis of information on this podcast without first seeking legal advice from counsel. Information on this podcast may not be up to date depending on the time of publishing and the time of viewership. The content of this posting is provided as is. No representations are made that the content is error-free. The views expressed in or through this podcast are those of the individual speakers, not those of their respective employers or Global Training Center as a whole. All liability with respect to actions taken or not taken based on the contents of this podcast are hereby expressly disclaimed.